We're in the fifth week of a very enjoyable series called I Don't Know What I Believe. I Don't Know What I Believe. And this has been a very enjoyable series over the course of 5 weeks. And I'm excited about the content today as well. We're going to ask a question today that a lot of people perhaps have from time to time in your life, whether you are a believer or a non-believer. I think this question would probably apply to you. But it's simply this: who was Jesus? And we're going to ask it from a believer's standpoint. Why do I believe in Jesus? Who was he? Who was he? So again, whether you're a believer in Christ here today or you're not a believer, I think this will be some substantial, some strong information for you. We're going to speak directly to those of us who do believe in Jesus. And we're just going to take a look at 4 different angles to ask the question, who was he? There's a lot of questions. There's a lot of conversation in the politically correct world that we live in. And it's quite common to hear, there are many different ways to God as long as you're sincere and you're sincerely seeking all roads lead to God. Well, Jesus said that that's not the case. The Bible writes and the Gospels record that Jesus claims to be the only way to God. So we want to look at that and examine that a little bit today. Why do we believe in Jesus? What do we have to go on? Maybe you've heard the story of a little girl who was in 4th grade, and it was during this Easter season, somewhat like the season we are in right now, and her teacher overheard her talking about Easter at school, and she said, you can't talk about that here at school. We don't talk about Christian things in the classroom. And the little girl said, but it's Easter, and Jesus rose from the dead. And the teacher said, I'm sorry you believe that. Christians can be foolish. Jesus did not rise from the dead. The little girl said, oh, yes, he did. Teacher said, no, he didn't. The Roman soldiers stole the body of Jesus. The girl said, no, they didn't. And the teacher said, well, then prove it. And 4th grade girl, so she's a little bit frustrated, and she didn't really know what to say to this, and so she says, I can't prove it. But when I die and go to heaven, I'll ask those Roman guards, and they'll tell me they didn't do it. The teacher said, but what if they're not in heaven? Those guards aren't in heaven. The little girl said, well, when you die, then you can ask them. Not sure what the response was to that, but what? Why do we believe in Jesus? What do we have to go on? And again, 4 different angles we're going to look at today. And again, in the series, I don't know what I believe. And so this is this is the center, the core of who we are as Christians. Jesus at the center. Because at North Rock, we have some major beliefs, and one of them is simply that Jesus is Lord. And that you must believe that He is Lord in order to have eternal salvation. And you must believe that God raised Him from the dead, according to the Bible, which we believe to be the Word of God. And so I want to look at 4 different things. And the first thing we're going to look at today is simply this: who did Jesus Himself claim to be? Who did Jesus Himself claim to be? What did He say about Himself? And because you got to admit, almost nobody debates the actual existence of Jesus. Even His detractors admit that He existed. In general, people don't dislike His teaching. Some of it was challenging, yes. Some of it was a bit in your face at times. But the essence of His teaching was loving people and generosity, giving to others, forgiving others. So even his teachings aren't necessarily debated, his existence not so much, but what people debate is his exclusive claim to be God, to be the Son of God, to be the only way to the Father, only way to God. So here are a couple of the things that Jesus said about himself, and both of these are from the Gospel of John. In the New Testament of the Bible, the first 4 books are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they are all 4 biographies, essentially, of Jesus, of the life of Christ. And in the 4th Gospel, John said this in John 14 and verse 6. He wrote that Jesus answered and said this, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Wow, I mean, that's a strong thing to say. It's quite a claim to make. Quite the Messiah complex, if you will. Jesus, are you really saying there's no other way to get to God except through you? That's what he was saying. In John chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus made almost an even bolder statement when he said this, "I and the Father are one." Another time he said, "When you've seen me, you have seen the Father." He said, "I and the Father are one." And statements like this really began to freak specifically the religious folk out in his day. What do you mean by that? Are you saying you are God in flesh? Are you saying you're God with skin on? Are you really claiming to be the Messiah? Because this is what separates Jesus from other characters, other people that are followed in spiritual ways, like Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius. None of them necessarily claim to be God, but Jesus said, "I and the Father, well, we're one. And if you're going to get to God, if you're going to get to the Father, you've got to go through me." So that's what offended so many people about Jesus. Listen, if we believe in Jesus, we need to know why. We need to know why we believe in him. Because if Jesus is who he says he is, if he is the Son of the living God, if he was born of a virgin, if he did live a sinless life, and then he did say that you've got to deny yourself and follow me, if this is true, then we must surrender the rest of our lives. We should give everything that we have, everything that we are, empowered by God's Spirit to pursue him and to live for him in every single way. Every single way. So let's explore this a little bit further. This is what Jesus said about himself, but let's put Jesus to the test in a couple of other areas. What did other people say about Jesus? And by other people, I'm not talking about his disciples. Of course, they said a lot of things about him. There was much said about him, but we're going to look at 2 specific people that said something about Jesus who were not his fans, they were not his followers, they were not his disciples. They had no reason to believe in him except what they experienced. So what did other people say about Jesus? And the first one is a man named Pontius Pilate. And he was essentially the Roman who was in charge in Jerusalem during the day that Jesus was arrested and tried and ultimately crucified. He was the Roman in charge because Rome was in charge of Jerusalem, in charge of the entire territory. And so whenever the religious people brought Jesus and wanted to crucify him, they had no authority to crucify him themselves because they weren't the ruling, governing body. They had to get permission from Rome. Rome had to say, "Okay, you can crucify him." They couldn't just take him and crucify him themselves. And so they brought Jesus to Pilate, essentially to be the Roman judge, to be the judge. And they made their case before Pilate. These are all the things he's done. He's speaking blasphemy. He's claiming to be the Son of God. He's claiming to be the Messiah. He's doing all of these things and claiming, and that's blasphemy. It's against our laws, and he should be punished. He must die. Well, Pilate takes him in, again, a Roman, and he has no reason to believe in Jesus at all. But what was happening is he was under such pressure, and there was such a ruckus going on. The best thing for Pilate to do was to be able to just get this whole thing off of his plate and let them crucify Jesus. He didn't care about Jesus. All he cared about was keeping peace. And if it was going to bring peace to Jerusalem for them to crucify this man, then crucify this man. So he brings Jesus in and starts questioning him and wants to find out what this is all about. After questioning him, and Jesus was actually brought to Pilate 2 different times, but after the second time, he said, listen, I can't find anything that he's done. In the words of Pilate, John 18, verse 38, Pilate said these words, "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this, he went out again to the Jews, and he said, "I find no basis for the charges against this man. I find no basis for a charge against him." Another version said, "I find no fault in him." I find no fault in him. I mean, he hasn't done anything wrong. I hear what y'all are saying, but I can't find any fault in this man, to crucify him. Ultimately, Pilate still made the decision to wash his hands and say, listen, I find no fault with this man, but if you want to crucify him, my hands are clean, crucify him. He's just trying to keep peace because the crowds were so loud and his accusers were yelling so loud. The Bible said their voices prevailed. And Pilate just said, enough, crucify him. I don't want to be held accountable, but crucify him. But I find no fault with this man. I tell you what, the next time that you're kind of wrestling with a Messiah complex, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. You're wrestling with being, maybe the Son of God. I ask someone if they can find any fault with you. Maybe a coworker, maybe a spouse. I asked, Alicia, do I have any faults, sweetheart, my wife? And she said, do you want the whole list or just the top 100? Where do you want me to start with your faults? But with Jesus, Pilate, who was looking for, if I could just find one thing that the man has done wrong, if I can find one thing that is very obvious to me as an outsider he's done, we can crucify him and this whole thing can be off my plate. But Pilate said, I can't find anything that he has done wrong. Of course, they did take him and crucify him, as I said a moment ago. And after they crucified him, if you know the story of the crucifixion, when Jesus died, some amazing things happened. There was an earthquake, the sky grew dark, and the wind blew, and it was some unique weather patterns, as well as some other things happened as in the moment that Jesus breathed his last breath. And the Roman guards who were there, who put him on the cross, and these Roman guards now, they were, I'm sure, quite bloodthirsty. The opportunity to crucify someone, I'm sure, was quite enjoyable to them. It made their day exciting. They got to torture someone, and when Jesus was crucified, of course, he was beaten and tortured. And the story of the crucifixion is one that is very heavy and yet so real and so powerful to all of us. But there was a Roman centurion that made a statement after Jesus died, according to the Gospel of Matthew, is the account that we'll read here. In Matthew chapter 27, in verse number 54, Matthew says this: When the centurion, that Roman centurion, and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake, and this is what happened immediately when Jesus died, saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified, and they exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." So here's a Roman soldier, Roman centurion, a commander, who could have been the one that had the spear thrusted in the side of Jesus. Maybe he was the one that put the crown of thorns on his head and pushed it down. Maybe he was the one when Jesus said, I thirst, put vinegar on a cloth and put it up to his mouth when Jesus was so thirsty. Maybe he was the one who helped nail the nails into the hands, the wrists of Jesus to help hold him to the cross while he was done. Maybe he was certainly there, involved in the whole incident. And when Jesus died, something so significant happened that this man, who was certainly not a believer, made this statement: surely he was the Son of God. That's significant. What did other people say about Jesus? Pilate, I find no fault with him. The Roman centurion, wow, he must have been the Son of God. And the third thing we're going to look at today is what are some of the things that Jesus did? What did he do during his ministry? Jesus was basically 30 years old before he came on the scene publicly and started performing miracles and teaching. He had this incident that happened when he was a small boy, that he kind of got separated from his parents, and his parents frantically were looking for him, and they found him in the temple as a 9-year-old boy teaching the religious people. And they were sitting there with their jaw agape, wondering how this boy is speaking all of these things. But other than that one incident, we really know nothing about Jesus from his birth until he came on the scene publicly at age 30. And for 3.5 years, he had a strong ministry. And during that 3.5 years of ministry, he was known for his teachings that were challenging and inspiring and some a little bit crazy. He was known for his miracles, but he was very popular. Everywhere that he went, he was surrounded by people. And throngs of people and multitudes of people would just follow him and flock around him. When he came into town, people heard about it. I mean, it was like the paparazzi was out. They were crazy. They were out everywhere. They were behind every bush. They would just come out and literally, he would walk through the crowd and there would be so many people around him trying to press in close to him that he couldn't even hardly walk. We were at a baseball game on Friday night. The Rangers and the Astros played here in town, an exhibition game at the Alamo Dome, and we like baseball in our family, so we went to the game with a bunch of other people that my kids play ball with, and before the game started, some of the players were out on the field, and one well-known player, his name is Prince Fielder, who is new to the Rangers this year. He's very popular because he hits home runs. He's a big hitter. And plus, he's got a great name, Prince Fielder. Alicia said, that's a great baseball name. I said, I never really thought about that, but it is. It's like a doctor named Dr. Pill, whom I know a doctor named Dr. Pill. But Prince is a great baseball player, and he's a nice guy, too, apparently, because he came over to the side and was signing autographs before the game, and whenever he walked up to the side, it was like this mass of children, but not just children, some adults too, coming flying down to the front, and people were crawling over rows, and the poor people that were trying to sit right there were just like, get out, you're making me still spill my drink. But it was just crazy as people were flocking to where Prince was there signing the autographs. And poor little Britain got so close to getting that autograph and didn't quite get it. He said, I was this close, Dad. And Prince had to leave. But anyway, it was when Jesus came to town, people flocked. I mean, I'm trying to think of who it would even relate to. I guess, a year ago we would have said Bieber. I don't know if we would say that anymore, but whoever it would be that if you heard he was in town, people would just flock to him. And that's how Jesus was. His teachings, he was so popular. Listen to what was wrote about him in Mark chapter 6. Mark wrote in his gospel, Mark 6. It's the second gospel of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark. He said, when the Sabbath rode, Mark 6 and 2, when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that has been given to him, and what are these remarkable miracles that he is performing? Remarkable miracles that he is performing. Crowds just coming around. One story told of a man named Zacchaeus who was a short man. And he couldn't see Jesus because he was surrounded by people. So Zacchaeus climbed a tree. He climbed a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. That's the song we sang in Sunday school when I was a child. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. Anyway, that's how the song went. So Zacchaeus climbed up a tree so he could see Jesus. That's how many people were around him. He was performing miracles, did all sorts of things. He was opening blind eyes. He was healing deaf ears. He was causing the mute to speak. A guy with a shriveled up hand, Jesus came to him, prayed over him, and his hand was healed. He cast out demons. He took 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish from a little boy one day and started breaking it and putting it into baskets to the point where 5,000 men ate from those 5 pieces of bread and fish, as well as women and children. Miracles, walking on water. People don't just walk on water. Don't try that. I mean, you can in your pool if you'd like, but don't try that in the ocean. Don't try that in the sea. He calmed the storm. It's a story of when Jesus was in the boat with his disciples and a storm blew up and Jesus was sleeping and the disciples were freaked out because they're all about to die. And Jesus was sleeping. And they woke him up, you got to get out, we're all about to die. And Jesus is like, you just got so little faith. And he speaks to the storm and the wind subsided. And even his followers were like, what? Who is this man that even the wind obeys his voice? Powerful miracles. He raised the dead. He raised the dead. A man named Lazarus had died. He'd been in the tomb for 3 days, and Jesus comes on the scene. Everybody's mad at Jesus because he didn't show up before the dude died. If you'd have been here, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus is like, you've got, you're such little faith. Listen, I'm the resurrection and the life. Roll away the stone. Jesus, he stinks by now. He's been in there 3 days. Let's just let it go. Nope. Roll away the stone. Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus comes hopping out of the tomb because he's wrapped in grave clothes, so he didn't just walk out. But Lazarus comes out, and as he hopped out, Jesus told the people around, take the graves, take the stuff off of him, clean him up. He's fine. He raised the dead. Jesus healed leprosy, horrible disease, incurable. Jesus healed. And nobody, not even Pharisees who hated him, debated the validity of his miracles. They didn't. They saw it with their own eyes. They knew what he was doing. They wanted him to stop because they had a problem with the fact that he was doing these miracles and he was claiming to be the Messiah. And that, went against their theology. And let's give them a little bit of a break. Because if someone showed up here this morning claiming to be the Messiah, claiming to be God, well, you know what we would think. So let's give them a little bit of a break. Although they should have understood and should have recognized it, they had a problem with what he was doing, and they wanted him to stop. But even his haters didn't deny that he was performing some significant miracles and that his teaching was powerful. That's what Jesus did. And the fourth thing I want to look at is the biggie, the big one. And it's this whole thing about the resurrection. Because the story of Jesus really gets interesting with the resurrection. And as I will tell you, and I'll speak about it a little bit on Easter Sunday morning, Christianity is not about necessarily, it wouldn't be here if it were just for the teachings of Jesus or the miracles of Jesus. The reason Christianity is here and the reason we believe in Jesus the way we believe in Jesus is because of the event called the resurrection. When Jesus died, was buried in the tomb, 3 days later on that Sunday morning, God raised him from the dead. And Scripture claims that Jesus was raised back to life. Jesus said it was going to happen, and then the Scriptures tell us that it did happen. In fact, the Apostle Peter, who was, again, one of the followers of Jesus, talked about him a little bit last week. Anytime you want to catch up on any of the sermons in a series, you need to know you can go to northrocksa.com. You can go to our website and you can watch or listen to all of our sermons. So you can catch up on this entire series. But I talked a little bit about Peter last week, but what happened was after Jesus died, was buried and resurrected from the grave, he hung out with his followers for 40 days after resurrecting before he ascended into heaven. And told them taught them some incredible things, kind of opened their eyes and enlightened them about a lot of things. And then he sent them to Jerusalem, and the Spirit of the Lord fell in Acts chapter 2, and kind of the new church was kicked off, the church that we're still a part of today. And the apostles were empowered, and they started working miracles themselves, by the power of Jesus. And so Peter and John were walking one day into the temple courts just to worship, and there sat outside the temple a lame man who said, "Alms, please give me money. Basically, I want some food. I want something to buy food with." And Peter said, "I don't have any money for you, but what I do have, I will give you. In the name of Jesus, rise up and walk." And this man was healed. He began to jump, and he was worshiping. And, of course, everybody around, even inside the temple and outside, were astonished at what was happening. And so, because they knew this man had been lame for basically his entire life, and he had been at the temple many years begging, and so everyone knew him. So they knew this was an amazing miracle. And they're like, "How are you doing this? Peter, what happened?" And here's what Peter said in Acts chapter 3, verse 15. He said, "You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead." Speaking to them about Jesus, this was just a portion of his speech to them. "You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this." So Peter said, "We witnessed him alive. We watched it all go down. We were there when he was arrested. We were there when he was crucified. And he appeared to us after his resurrection. We are witnesses of this." And now, admittedly, there is a lot of debate around the resurrection. And I understand it because it's crazy. It's crazy. It takes some significant faith to believe that someone could die and that God could raise them from the dead. So there really aren't a lot of debates around the existence of Jesus, around the quality of his teaching, but there's a lot of debate and question around, was he really raised from the dead? Many people believe, like the teacher in the story at the beginning of my sermon, that the Roman soldiers stole the body of Jesus. So he's not really risen. A couple of things to consider when you think about the resurrection, however, and disproving the resurrection. The Roman soldiers and the enemies of Jesus would have loved nothing more than to produce a dead body. Whenever his followers started saying, "He's alive, he's alive, he resurrected," all they had to do to shut that up, to shut that down, was to produce a dead body. Not only the Romans, but also the religious people of that day who were responsible for having him crucified because he claimed to be the Messiah. When all of this talk about a resurrection started happening, all they had to do was produce a body. Well, they never produced a body. Other people say, well, the disciples of Jesus stole the body. And I guess it's possible, plausible, if you can imagine that these unarmed and untrained disciples overpowered the best of the best Roman guards who were kind of like today's UFC fighters. I mean, they were the toughest of the tough. And I guess it's plausible. You also have to remember that if that would have happened, then those Roman soldiers, those tough big guys, UFC fighters of that day, would have had to say, "Well, yeah, they came and stole it from us. I mean, we weren't really paying attention. We were playing cards, or we were sleeping, and man, they snuck up on us and they blindsided. They were a lot tougher than we thought they would be, especially that little tax collector guy. I mean, he was a fireball. I mean, he punched us in the nose, and they stole the body of Jesus." That's quite far-fetched. But this is what is most significant about this story to me. Consider the followers of Jesus, those 12 disciples. It was 11 because whenever Jesus died, because Judas wound up committing suicide after he sold Jesus. But then the apostles appointed another disciple, so they added a 12. But consider the lives of those disciples. Other than Judas, only one died of old age, and that was John. How did the other 10 die? The other 10, to a man, all died the death of a martyr. After severe torture and persecution, they lost their lives for the cause of Jesus. would these men, all 10 of them, really give their life for something they knew was a lie? And Scripture tells us that Jesus, again, was seen after the resurrection. There were witnesses. He was seen on the road to Emmaus. He was seen quickly after his resurrection by some ladies. He was seen on the mountainside. He was seen by the disciples in a room that Jesus appeared to them in. Some 500 in the book of Acts, or the book of Acts claims that some 500 saw the risen Christ before he ascended into heaven. There were witnesses. So, just to think through this rationally, ask this question: Did 11 ordinary, mostly uneducated men really devise the most grand scheme in the history of the world, pull it off, keep it a secret, with no personal motivation for self-gain? No. In fact, this elaborate hoax would have had severe, and did have severe, personal cost and loss, causing them to be hated, despised, rejected, abused, tortured, and ultimately martyred. Would they really pull off a hoax like this, all in order to cheat the world into being a better place? Ask yourself that question. These men had something to believe in, something they had seen, something they had witnessed, something they had experienced, something that was tangible, something that they had touched. They knew that they knew that they knew that they knew that they had something to believe in. For you 80s rockers, there are a few of you here this morning. They had something to believe in. Listen to what Jesus said about himself again in John chapter 8, verse 46. John writes that Jesus said, "Can any of you prove me guilty of sin?" Jesus asked the question. "If I'm telling the truth, why don't you believe in me?" And this is where the rubber meets the road with this whole idea about Jesus. And some saying, well, he was a good man, he was a good prophet. But if he's telling the truth, why don't you believe in me? Why don't you believe in him? I found something this week that I wanted to share with you because I was already completely finished with my sermon. I prepare early in the week, so early in the week I was completely finished with my sermon, and I find this video clip accidentally, and I'm like, what? And I showed it to Alicia. I said, I got to show this Sunday morning because some people might not believe me, but if they don't believe me, maybe they would believe Bono. Yeah, way to go, Bono. If I'm telling the truth, why don't you believe me? So, at the end of the day, there really are only two options. Either Jesus was a liar or a nutter, as Bono says, or he is the Savior of the world. You have trouble saying he was a great man, a great teacher, because how can you say that? Because he claimed to be the Messiah. So he's either Messiah or he is crazy. If Jesus was lying, if Jesus was pretending to be something he was not, don't you think at some point he would have broken? Don't you think at some point maybe whenever they arrested him and began to beat him, he would have said, guys, hey, it was all a joke. Don't you think at some point, maybe when they stripped him naked and began to beat him to the point where he was disfigured, you couldn't hardly tell it was even a human being? Don't you think at some point he would have said, it's all a joke? Don't you think at some point, if he were just a man, if it was all a hoax, if it was all a lie, that he would have said, stop, guys. This has gone far enough. This has gone far enough. I believe with all of my heart that Jesus Christ is Lord of all, and that he is God with skin on. The Father sent his Son, Jesus, to give His life so that we could have freedom from sin, that the purpose of Him coming to this earth was to die so that I could have freedom from my sins. Not just to die and pay that price, but to conquer death by overcoming death and resurrecting from the grave. That's what I believe about Jesus. Jesus asked His followers, He asked Matthew, His disciples, Peter, in the Gospel of Matthew, a significant question. In Matthew chapter 16, I don't have it on the screen, but Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples began to say, well, some say you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist. You're one of the prophets. Jesus looked back at them and looked specifically at Peter and said, "Peter, who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God." So I would ask that question this morning. I think it would be appropriate to ask that question today. Who do you say that Jesus is? And there are really only two groups in this room this morning. There are those of you that really believe that Jesus is the way, that He is the Messiah, and there are those that would say, I'm not quite there yet. I'm really not sure. And that's okay. I want you to know that is okay. It's okay for you to still have questions. We all have questions. That's why we're doing a series like this. And there's no way in 5 weeks that we answer all of our questions. We will always have questions. That's okay. But for those of you that would say, I do believe that Jesus is the Messiah, let me ask you this. Have your actions reflected the lordship of Christ? Have you taken a step of faith and said yes to Him? Are you living your life in response by having positive Christ-like attitudes and how you're spending your time and raising your children? How are you living in response to the lordship that you say you believe? And my guess is that in this room, there'd be many of us that in a very humble and broken moment before God would probably need to have this holy moment where we would say, God, my actions have not reflected the lordship of Christ that I do believe in. And that it would be a great moment for us to say, Lord, forgive me. Change me. Adjust my priorities and help me put you first. Would you close your eyes? I want to pray for you. I want to pray for you here this morning.